The evening sun was slowly sinking behind the hills, spreading an orange glow over the wide plains of the Wild West. The land looked endless, with golden grass swaying in the dry wind and a few cattle grazing far in the distance. A lonely dirt road led to a wooden ranch house that stood quiet and still, as if it had been waiting for something or perhaps someone. Along that road, a young woman was walking with tired steps. Her dress was dusty, the hem torn from days of travel, and her shoes were so worn that every stone on the ground seemed to hurt her feet. But she kept walking, her eyes fixed on the wooden gate ahead. She had been on the road for days with little food, no family to guide her, and no idea of where she truly belonged. The world had not been kind to her, but she carried a spark inside her, the kind of spark that made people push forward even when everything around them told them to stop. She saw the ranch house in the distance with smoke rising faintly from its chimney, and she felt a mix of hope and fear. She knew nothing about who lived there, but she had to try. Her hands clutched her small bundle of belongings, no more than a few pieces of clothing wrapped in cloth. That bundle was all she owned in the world. The widowed rancher sat on his porch that evening, a wide-brimmed hat shading his tired face as he watched over his land. He was a man of few words, a man who had spent years working under the hot sun with calloused hands and eyes that carried both strength and sadness. Since his wife had passed away, his house had been silent. The dishes sat untouched. The kitchen smelled of nothing but old wood, and his meals were often no more than a slice of bread and black coffee. He worked the land, fixed the fences, cared for the cattle, and at night he sat on the same porch staring into the dark sky, listening to the wind whisper through the fields. The neighbors often said he was a good man but broken inside, like a strong tree struck by lightning. He had grown used to the loneliness, or at least that was what he told himself. That evening, as he leaned back in his chair, he noticed movement on the road. At first he thought it might be a ranch hand or a traveler passing through, but as the figure drew closer he realized it was a young woman. Her shoulders slumped, yet her steps determined. She stopped at the gate, lifted her head, and looked straight toward the porch where he sat. The rancher did not move. He simply watched, curious and cautious. Strangers did not often wander this far into his land. The woman's heart was pounding as she reached the gate. She knew this was the moment. Either the man before her would turn her away, and she would have to face the cold night under the open sky, or he would give her a chance. She gripped the gate with shaky hands, then pushed it open and walked slowly toward the porch. Each step seemed heavier than the last, but she did not stop until she was standing just a few feet away from him. The rancher set his hat aside, his gray eyes steady, waiting for her to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but she found her courage. "If I cook and clean," she asked softly, "can I stay?" Those simple words carried her whole story. She had nothing else to offer but her hands, her effort, and her willingness to work. She did not ask for comfort or money, only for a place where she could belong, even if it meant scrubbing floors and cooking meals from dawn till night. The rancher did not answer right away. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and studied her face. He saw the dust on her cheeks, the tiredness in her eyes. But he also saw something else, a spark of determination, the same spark he had once seen in himself when he was younger, and still believed the world could give him more than sorrow. Silence filled the air between them. The woman feared she had asked too much. She lowered her head, ready to turn away. Then slowly the rancher stood. He walked to the side of the porch, pulled up a wooden chair, and placed it beside his own. It was a simple gesture, but it carried more weight than words. By pulling up that chair, he was inviting her not only to rest her tired body, but also to share the quiet space that had been empty for too long. The woman's eyes filled with tears she tried hard to hide. She set down her small bundle and sat on the chair, her heart beating with a mix of relief and gratitude. The wind rustled the trees, and for the first time in years the porch did not feel so lonely. The rancher looked out across the land again. The same view he had seen every evening, but tonight it felt different. There was someone sitting beside him, someone who had asked for nothing more than a chance to work and stay. He did not know her past, and she did not know his, but in that moment, it seemed that fate had led them both to this meeting. The woman sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the wooden chair beneath her and the cool evening air brushing against her face. She thought about the many nights she had spent alone, wondering if she would ever find a place where she could rest without fear of being sent away. This porch, this chair, this silence, It all felt like the beginning of something she had long prayed for. She did not know if the rancher would keep her promise or if tomorrow he might change his mind, but for that evening she was not alone. That was enough. The rancher finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "This is a working ranch," he said. "It's no easy life. The mornings come early, the days are long, and the work never ends." He paused, glancing at her. "If you can handle that, then we'll see." It was not a full yes, but it was not a no either. It was a test, a challenge, and perhaps even an opening for trust. The woman nodded quickly, her heart lifting. "I can," she whispered. "I will." As the last light of day faded and the stars began to appear, the two of them sat side by side in silence. The porch creaked under their weight. The cattle moved softly in the distance, and the lantern hanging by the door cast a warm glow over their faces. Neither of them said much more that night, but something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that life had been hard for both, but maybe together they could make it easier. The night deepened, and the rancher finally stood, opening the door to the house. "Come inside," he said simply. She followed him, carrying her bundle close to her chest. The house smelled of old wood and dust, but to her it smelled like shelter. She stepped inside, her heart still racing, and knew that this was the place where her new chapter would begin. The first morning on the ranch came earlier than the woman had expected. She had barely closed her eyes when the rooster crowed, and the faint light of dawn began to spread across the wide plains. She opened her eyes to find herself in a small room with wooden walls, a single bed, and a blanket that smelled faintly of hay and smoke. It was not fancy, but to her it felt like safety. She sat up, smoothed her hair with her hands, and reminded herself of the promise she had made the night before. If she cooked and cleaned, maybe she could stay. She went to the kitchen quietly, afraid to disturb the rancher. The kitchen was simple and bare, with a wooden table, a stove, and shelves that held only a few pots and jars. Dust covered the corners and cobwebs stretched across the high beams. She noticed that the sink had not been scrubbed in a long time, and the counters carried stains from many meals cooked without care. She placed her hands on the table and took a deep breath. This was where she would begin. She rolled up her sleeves, found a bucket of water, and started scrubbing as the sky outside turned brighter. The rancher stepped into the kitchen as the first rays of sunlight poured through the small window. He paused at the doorway, surprised to see her already working. Her sleeves were wet. Her hair was falling around her face, and her hands were red from scrubbing. She looked up, worried he might be angry, but he only gave a small nod before walking to the stove to put on the kettle for coffee. They exchanged no words, only a quiet acknowledgement. To him, it was unusual to see someone else in his kitchen after so many years of silence. To her, it was proof that she was keeping her end of the promise. By the time breakfast was ready, the kitchen looked different. She had wiped the counters, arranged the jars neatly, and cleaned the stove until it shone faintly. The rancher sat at the table drinking his coffee, while she placed a plate of warm biscuits, eggs, and fried potatoes in front of him. For years he had lived on bread and plain beans, never taking the time to cook more than he needed. Now the smell of a real meal filled the room, and he found himself watching her as she moved around the kitchen with careful steps. He took a bite, and though he did not say much, the slight lift of his brow told her he noticed the difference. Days turned into weeks, and the woman kept her promise every single day. She woke before the sun, lit the stove, and prepared breakfast. She scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and dusted every corner of the house. She repaired torn curtains with thread she had found in a drawer, and she polished the old wooden furniture until it looked alive again. In the evenings, she prepared supper with whatever the ranch provided: fresh milk, vegetables from a small garden, or meat from the smokehouse. The house, which had once felt cold and forgotten, began to look warm and lived in again. The rancher, though still quiet, began to notice the small changes. He would come in from the fields after a long day of fixing fences or tending to cattle, and find the table set neatly with food that smelled of home. He would sit, tired and dusty, and watch her as she carefully poured coffee or placed bread on the table. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, but she had a way of humming softly while she worked, a tune without words that filled the silence with a strange comfort. He realized that the house no longer felt empty. There was movement, sound, and even a kind of peace, yet not everyone welcomed the change. The neighbors in town began to whisper about the stranger at the ranch. They saw her when she came into town for supplies, carrying a basket and wearing a patched dress. Some wondered who she was, where she had come from, and why the widowed rancher had allowed her to stay. Old voices carried gossip quickly in those small towns. "He's letting trouble into his home," some said. Others thought she was hiding something. The rancher heard the whispers when he went to town, but he never answered them. He simply tipped his hat and walked on. People could say what they wanted. It was his ranch, his choice. For the woman, the whispers made her uneasy, but she worked harder to prove herself. She knew that in a land like this, respect was earned through effort, not words. She made sure the house stayed neat, the meals stayed warm, and her place in the rancher's home was never questioned. She wanted him to see that she was not a burden but a blessing. Each time she heard the neighbors' voices, she reminded herself of the chair he had pulled up for her on the porch that first evening. That gesture gave her strength. Slowly, the quiet companionship between them grew. They rarely spoke of their pasts, but they shared the present in simple ways. On some evenings, after supper, they would sit on the porch together, listening to the crickets sing and watching the stars light up the sky. The rancher would lean back in his chair, while she sat with her hands folded on her lap, the lantern glow soft on her face. They did not need to fill the air with words. The silence itself became a kind of language between them. She learned his habits, the way he always checked the barn before nightfall, the way he sat with his hat tilted when he was deep in thought, the way he tapped his boots on the porch when the day had been long. And he in turn noticed her small touches, the fresh flowers she placed on the table, the way she folded his shirts after mending them, the quiet smile she gave when he said thank you, even if only once in a while. One afternoon, after a long day in the fields, the rancher returned to find her kneeling by the fireplace, scrubbing the hearth until it gleamed. He stood for a moment, watching her without her noticing. The light from the fire flickered on her face, and in that moment, he saw not just a helper or a stranger, but someone who was slowly weaving herself into the fabric of his life. It startled him, yet it also gave him a feeling he had not known in years, a feeling that the house was no longer just his but theirs. But the ranch was not a place for dreams alone. Work was endless and life was hard. Fences broke, storms threatened the cattle, and the land demanded strength. The woman took part in it all. She learned to carry buckets of water, to gather eggs from the henhouse, and even to ride a horse when the rancher needed her help. Though her hands blistered and her body ached, she never complained. She wanted to show him she could endure, and in return he began to look at her with respect, not pity. That respect grew into something deeper, though neither of them dared to name it yet. The rancher had loved once before, and grief still lingered in his heart. The woman carried secrets of her own past, shadows she was afraid to reveal. For now it was enough to share the work, the meals, and the quiet evenings. It was enough that the house was no longer silent and the porch no longer empty. As autumn settled on the land, the neighbors continued to talk, but the rancher stopped listening. He knew the truth of what he saw in his own home. The woman who had once stood at his gate asking only for a place to stay was no longer just a stranger. She was part of the rhythm of his days, a presence that made the wide, empty ranch feel alive again. And though neither of them spoke of the future, both began to wonder, perhaps silently, perhaps only in their hearts, what more this life together might bring. The months passed quietly on the ranch, and the rhythm of life settled into a pattern. Each morning began with the sound of the rooster, the creak of the barn door, and the smell of wood smoke rising from the kitchen stove. The woman kept busy from dawn to dusk, her hands always moving, her eyes always watchful. She cleaned, cooked, and mended. But she also added little touches that slowly transformed the lonely ranch into something more. Fresh flowers appeared in jars on the table, curtains fluttered neatly in the windows, and warm bread often sat cooling on the counter. The rancher noticed these small things even if he did not always say so. For the first time in years, the house no longer felt like a place of silence. The walls echoed faintly with her humming. The floor shone under her care, and the kitchen smelled of life. The rancher, who had long accepted loneliness as his companion, found himself watching her more often. He would return from the fields at dusk and pause in the doorway, looking at the glow of the lamp on her face as she worked at the table. There was something steady about her presence, something that made the emptiness of his grief soften just a little. Still, shadows lingered between them. The rancher's heart, though steady and kind, was not free of sorrow. The memory of his late wife rested deep in him, like a wound that had healed but left a scar. He had loved her dearly, and losing her had carved a silence that no amount of work could fill. Sometimes at night he sat on the porch alone, staring at the stars, thinking of her. He did not speak of it, but the woman could feel it in the way his eyes sometimes grew distant. She understood grief even if she did not know his full story. She carried her own shadows as well. Her past was something she rarely allowed herself to remember. But on stormy nights when the wind howled against the windows and lightning lit up the sky, she would feel fear creeping back into her heart. She had left something behind when she came to this ranch, something she dared not name aloud. It was a story of hardship, of mistakes, and of people who might not forgive her if they ever found her again. She prayed each day that the rancher would never ask too many questions, because she feared the truth might drive him to send her away. One such stormy night, the sky cracked open with thunder and rain poured down in heavy sheets across the plains. The ranch house shuddered under the force of the wind. The rancher sat by the fire, his boots drying nearby while the woman placed another log on the flames. The storm seemed endless, and in the flickering light of the fire she found herself unable to keep her secrets inside any longer. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I am afraid," she whispered. The rancher looked up, his steady eyes fixed on her. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap and tried to explain. "I came here with nothing. I left a past that I am not proud of. I worry that if you ever found out, you would send me away." Her words broke the silence of the room, and once spoken they seemed impossible to take back. The rancher said nothing at first. He studied her face, the way her eyes glistened with tears she was trying to hold back. His hands, weathered and strong, rested on his knees as he leaned forward slightly. The firelight flickered across his face, casting deep shadows. Finally, in a voice that was calm and steady, he answered. "This land," he said, "has a way of giving people second chances. It has done the same for me. I lost more than I thought I could bear, and yet here I am. Maybe it can do the same for you. I don't need to know your whole past right now. What I see is the work you do here every day, and that tells me enough." Her breath caught, and for the first time in years, she felt relief wash over her. He had not pressed her for details, nor had he judged her for the fear in her eyes. Instead, he offered something far more valuable than questions: trust. She nodded silently, wiping at her cheeks, and turned back to the fire. The storm raged outside, but inside the ranch house there was a fragile kind of peace. The days that followed seemed lighter after that night. She still carried her secrets, but she no longer felt as though she was carrying them alone. The rancher's quiet words echoed in her mind whenever doubt crept in. She found herself working with more energy, placing more care into every task. She planted flowers near the porch, scrubbed the wooden floors until they shone, and began baking pies with berries she gathered from nearby bushes. The rancher noticed the way her touch was spreading across the land, and though he rarely spoke of it, he appreciated it deeply. The ranch itself began to reflect this quiet renewal. The fences stood straighter, the barn smelled of fresh hay, and the garden flourished under her careful hands. Even the animals seemed calmer, as though they too sensed the change. Neighbors who once whispered began to notice the difference when they rode past. The ranch no longer looked abandoned or forgotten. It looked alive, and though people still talked, they could not deny that something good was happening there. On evenings when the work was done, the woman and the rancher sometimes walked together through the fields. The wide sky above them turned golden with sunset, and the grass glowed in the fading light. They did not always speak, but their steps fell in rhythm, and the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was a shared silence filled with unspoken understanding. She began to feel that maybe she belonged here after all, not just as someone who cooked and cleaned, but as someone who mattered. Yet even as hope grew, there were moments of doubt. She sometimes caught the rancher staring into the distance with a faraway look, and she wondered if he was thinking of his late wife. She could not compete with a memory, nor did she want to. She only hoped that in time, he would see her not as a shadow filling an empty house, but as someone building something new beside him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the horizon burned with shades of red and gold, she stood on the porch holding a basket of laundry. The rancher came up from the barn, his boots covered in dust, his shirt damp with sweat. He looked at her standing in the glow of the fading light, and for a moment their eyes met. There was something in his gaze that made her heart quicken. Not love, not yet, but a quiet recognition. It was as though he saw her not just as a helper or a stranger, but as part of the life he was beginning to rebuild. That night, as they sat at the table eating stew she had cooked, neither of them said much, but the silence was no longer empty. It carried a weight, a meaning, a promise of something unspoken. She thought of the chair he had pulled up for her on that first night, the simple gesture that had changed everything. She realized that what began as a desperate request to stay had become something much deeper. She was not just staying anymore. She was becoming part of the story of this land, part of the rancher's life, and perhaps part of his healing. The past still lingered like a shadow, but in the light of each new day, it seemed less frightening. She had found a place where she could work, where she could be trusted, and where her presence made a difference. The wide plains stretched endlessly beyond them. The sky opened with stars each night, and the rancher's steady presence gave her hope. She had asked only for shelter, but what she had been given was a chance at something far greater, a beginning she never thought she would have. The seasons rolled forward, and life on the ranch settled into a steady rhythm that was both hard and rewarding. The woman had now been there long enough that the house no longer looked like a stranger's place. It looked like home. She had grown used to the early mornings when the world was still quiet, and the land was covered with dew that sparkled in the first light of the sun. She had grown used to the smell of leather and hay, the sound of horses nickering in the barn, and the long days filled with endless tasks. But she had also grown used to something else, the feeling that she belonged. Each day brought its own challenges. The ranch was no easy place to keep. Fences needed constant mending, cattle wandered off, storms threatened the crops, and drought made water scarce. The rancher worked with steady hands and long hours, but now he was not alone. She had become more than someone who cooked and cleaned. She followed him into the fields, carried buckets of water, and even learned how to repair fences when his hands were too full. Though her body tired, she found strength she did not know she had, and he began to see her not as a burden but as a partner. The townsfolk noticed, too, though some still whispered. They would see her ride into town on a wagon beside the rancher, her head held a little higher than before. She walked into the general store with a quiet grace, buying flour, sugar, or fabric for sewing. At first, people looked at her with doubt, wondering about her past. But as weeks turned into months, the whispers grew quieter. The evidence was clear to anyone who cared to see. The once lonely ranch now thrived, and the widowed rancher was no longer the same man who had walked with his head down. He looked steadier, fuller, as though a weight had been lifted from him. But life on the frontier was never free from trouble. One summer evening, while the sky was still painted with streaks of pink and orange, a group of rough men rode up to the ranch. They were the kind who believed that a widower's land was easy to take, and that one man could not stand against them. Dust rose from their horses' hooves as they approached the gate. The rancher, hearing the noise, stepped out onto the porch. He stood tall, though he was outnumbered, his eyes steady as he looked at the men. The woman came from the kitchen, her apron still tied around her waist. She saw the strangers at the gate and the sharp glint of trouble in their eyes. Fear rose in her chest, but she did not run. Instead, she stepped forward, broom still in her hand from sweeping the porch. She planted herself near the steps, her shoulders squared, and lifted her chin. Her voice, though calm, carried firmness. "This is not your place," she said. "Respect the gate or turn back." The men laughed at first, surprised that it was a woman standing in their way. But her eyes did not waver, and her grip on the broom was strong. Behind her, the rancher's presence was quiet but powerful. The men muttered to themselves, perhaps expecting weakness, but finding none. After a tense moment, they turned their horses and rode away, leaving dust and silence behind. The rancher looked at her with new respect. In that moment, he saw that her courage was not small or hidden. It was the kind of courage that could stand at a gate and protect what mattered. From then on, something shifted between them. The rancher began to see her as more than someone who had asked for a chair on the porch. She was someone who fought for the life they were building, someone who was willing to face storms, droughts, and even men on horseback to protect the ranch. She was not just a helper anymore. She was part of it. The days continued, filled with the usual struggles of ranch life. The summer heat burned the fields, and water had to be carried from far away. At times, the cattle grew restless and fences broke. The rancher worked hard, but she was always there by his side, bringing him water, mending his gloves, or riding out to gather strays. At night, they sat on the porch side by side, listening to the soft chorus of crickets and watching the stars slowly appear. The silence between them had changed over time. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people who trusted each other without needing many words. The neighbors, who once doubted her, began to nod when they saw her. They noticed how she carried herself, how she walked beside the rancher with quiet pride. Some of the women in town began to greet her kindly when she came to buy supplies, and the storekeeper kept a chair ready for her when she arrived. Respect was not easy to earn in those times, especially for a woman with no known past. But she had earned it through her work and her courage. One evening, as autumn approached and the sky turned gold, the rancher returned from the fields to find her sitting on the porch mending a shirt. The lantern beside her lit her face softly, and the sound of her needle moving through the fabric filled the air. He sat down beside her, removing his hat and setting it on his knee. For a long time they said nothing, just listened to the night. Then, in a voice low and steady, he said, "You've changed this place." She looked up, startled by the rare words. "I only kept my promise," she answered. "I said I would cook and clean if you let me stay." He shook his head slightly. "You've done far more than that." His eyes were steady, and she felt her heart quicken at the weight of his words. She lowered her gaze to the shirt in her lap, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched, but it was a silence filled with meaning. In the days that followed, the bond between them grew stronger. They faced the challenges of the ranch not as two separate souls, but as partners. When the drought worsened, she helped carry water to the garden, her back aching but her will unbroken. When a storm tore down part of the barn roof, she held the ladder steady as he climbed to repair it. And when the cattle broke through the fence one night, she rode out with him under the moonlight, guiding the strays back with steady hands on the reins. Each trial brought them closer, weaving their lives together like threads in a cloth. The ranch began to reflect their shared effort. The garden bloomed, the house shone with care, and even the animals seemed calmer under their watch. It was not a life free from hardship, but it was a life filled with purpose. And purpose, they both knew, was worth more than comfort. As winter approached, the air grew colder and the evenings grew longer. They often sat together by the fire, sharing quiet meals and warm drinks. The rancher sometimes told her stories of the land, of cattle drives and storms he had survived. She listened with wide eyes, learning not just about the land, but about the man who had given her a chair when she needed it most. She rarely spoke of her own past, but little by little, she shared pieces of herself, memories of her childhood, songs her mother used to hum, dreams she once had before life had turned hard. The rancher listened, and though he did not ask for more than she was ready to give, he treasured every word. The world outside still carried its challenges, but inside the ranch house and across the fields, something had changed forever. The widowed rancher was no longer alone. The woman who had once stood at his gate asking only for a chance to work had become part of his days, part of his land, and part of his heart, even if neither of them spoke it aloud yet. The long winter passed, and the ranch slowly stepped into spring. The snow melted from the hills, the rivers began to swell again, and the grass in the open fields pushed up green and fresh. Life always returned to the land, no matter how hard the winter had been, and it felt as if the ranch itself was breathing easier. For the woman and the rancher, this season felt different from all the others they had lived before. They were no longer two separate people sharing the same roof out of necessity. They had become something else, something deeper, though neither of them had spoken it out loud. The house no longer looked empty. The curtains she had sewn moved gently in the breeze. The shelves in the kitchen were full and the table was never bare. On mornings, the smell of bread or biscuits filled the air, and on evenings the fire burned warmly while the sound of their quiet voices or shared silence filled the room. The rancher, who once lived with nothing but memory and grief, now had something to look forward to when he returned from the fields. She, who once carried fear that she would be sent away, now moved with a kind of peace that showed she belonged. But what mattered most was not just the house or the meals. It was the way they had learned to walk through life side by side. He had taught her how to guide a horse gently, how to check a fence for weak spots, and how to read the sky for signs of weather. She, in turn, had taught him the comfort of small things, the brightness of flowers by the porch, the warmth of soup after a long day, the strength of laughter in a home. Together they filled the spaces that had once been empty. One evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the plains with golden light, she set supper on the table as usual. The rancher came in from the fields, his hat in his hands, his boots dusty from the day's work. She served the meal quietly, just as she always did, and sat down across from him. For a while they ate in silence, the clinking of spoons and the crackle of the fire the only sounds in the room. Then something changed. Instead of remaining in his usual seat, the rancher stood, carried his plate, and placed it on the table beside her. He pulled up a chair and sat down at her side. The woman looked at him in surprise, her spoon frozen in her hand. For a moment she wondered if she had done something wrong, if perhaps he had needed more light or more space. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something steady and kind. He had chosen that seat not because of light or space, but because he wanted to sit near her. It was a small gesture, yet it spoke louder than any words. Her heart swelled as she lowered her spoon. That single act told her more than any promise could have. She was not just someone passing through, not just a helper, not just a cook or cleaner. She was part of his table, part of his home, part of his life. The chair he had pulled up for her months ago on the porch had been the beginning. But this chair, beside him at the supper table, was the sign of something lasting. They finished their meal quietly, yet the silence was rich with meaning. Afterward, they stepped out onto the porch together. The evening air was soft, carrying the scent of spring flowers and the sound of crickets. The sky stretched wide above them, filled with stars that seemed to go on forever. The woman wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and the rancher sat close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. For the first time, the porch did not feel like a place of loneliness or waiting. It felt like a place of belonging. The days that followed carried this new understanding between them. They still worked hard as the land required. The rancher mended fences and guided the cattle, while she kept the house, tended the garden, and joined him when extra hands were needed. But now their steps seemed lighter. The simple act of sharing a chair at the table had opened a door in both their hearts. They did not need to speak of it, for they both knew. They were no longer two people living side by chance. They were building something together, something steady and strong. Neighbors who visited the ranch began to see it too. The way the rancher looked at her when she spoke, the way she set his coffee down beside him with quiet care, the way they worked together in rhythm, it was clear to anyone with eyes. The whispers that once filled the town slowly faded, replaced by nods of respect. People saw that what had begun as doubt had turned into something real and undeniable. The widowed rancher was no longer alone, and the woman who once came with nothing now stood as part of something larger than herself. One Sunday afternoon, they rode into town together for supplies. The general store owner greeted them both with a smile and offered her a chair to rest while the rancher spoke with a neighbor. She sat quietly watching him from across the room, and she felt a wave of gratitude. The girl who once stood at a gate, asking if she could cook and clean to stay, was now treated as though she belonged, not just to the ranch, but to the life they were building. Later, as they rode back home in the wagon, the wide land stretched before them. The rancher held the reins steady, and she sat beside him, the wind tugging at her hair. They did not speak much, but she looked at him and felt a deep peace. The road, the land, the house waiting in the distance, all of it felt like part of a story that was no longer just his or hers, but theirs. When they reached the ranch, the cattle were grazing calmly, the barn stood tall, and the house glowed in the evening light. She stepped down from the wagon and looked at the porch where she had first stood months ago, trembling with fear, asking only for a chance. She remembered the way he had studied her, the silence that stretched, and the simple act of him pulling up a chair. That moment had been the turning point of her life, though she had not known it then. Now, standing on the same porch, she felt a quiet joy rise in her chest. The land still held its hardships, the work was still heavy, and the future was still uncertain. But she knew one thing clearly: she was no longer alone, and neither was he. Together, they had built something stronger than either of them could have done alone. That evening, after supper, they sat side by side on the porch, watching the sky turn dark. The rancher leaned back in his chair, his hat tilted slightly, and the woman sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The lantern cast a warm glow on their faces, and the night stretched around them. Neither of them needed to speak. The land, the house, the stars, and the quiet comfort of their companionship spoke louder than words. She had asked for so little when she arrived, just a place to stay in exchange for cooking and cleaning. What she had found was far greater, She had found safety, purpose, and a home. And the rancher, who had once thought his life would remain empty after loss, had found someone who gave his days new meaning. The wide plain stretched endlessly. The wind whispered through the grass, and the ranch stood strong against the horizon. And there, on that porch, two souls who had once been strangers sat together, not because of need or chance, but because they had chosen not to walk through life alone.